Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going over basic Java syntax and output for UIL Computer Science. We're beginning content today. So we can begin with a quick discussion about IDEs. Here I have Replit open. Let's repl.it. You can just enter that into the URL bar of your browser if you want to use an online IDE instead of a downloaded one. So if you want to use this, then you can just log in or make an account, and up here in the top left corner, you click on New REPL. Now here you get to choose a language, and we're going to be using Java. And here you name your REPL. We'll call it Test. I've already made one with this name, so I'll call it Test1. Alright, now it says REPL created. So here we're on the screen where most of the magic happens. Right here, as you'll see in just a second, we have something called our main.java, and this essentially is where we'll type out all of our code. Right here there's a big button that says run, and once we're confident with our code or we want to try it out, then we click on run, and whatever it outputs will go right here in the console. Alright, and in this other tab, if you don't want to use Replit, or you don't want to use any online IDE, and you'd rather use a downloaded and installed one, you first need to make sure that you have the Oracle JDK. So just search up Oracle JDK download on Google or your search engine of choice, and just find one that has a download for version 8 or later. As long as you have version 8 or later, you'll be fine. As far as UIL Computer Science goes. Once you're on a page like this, just make sure that you're installing from Oracle, so you can tell if it's oracle.com, just so you don't get a virus or anything. And also make sure that you install based on what operating system you're using. So install Windows if you need the Windows, Mac OS if you need the Mac OS, etc. Right. So just download that. Run it, unzip it if you need to, and it'll install all of it for you. It should be no problem. Alright, so now let's try the same thing that we did in REPL, but now let's do it in Eclipse. Right. So when you open up Eclipse for the first time after installing it, this is what will show up, more or less. You can choose a workspace. Just choose wherever you want on your computer, where you know you can access your files consistently and they won't be tampered with. Then you can click on Launch. Alright, and now we have a loading screen. As you'll probably notice, there are a lot of loading screens for online IDEs, downloaded IDEs. They're not exactly fast when it comes to opening up, but in my opinion, they make up for their speed in their functionality and versatility. They can be slow to load, especially if you have a computer that's a little bit old, like my one is. And that's probably why it takes a while for me. I think another downside of having an installed IDE is that if you use it, let's say at school, if you're using a laptop at school and you also code at school, then sometimes it'll take a lot of your battery life away. So you'll have to be sure that you bring a charger with you. All right. So now that Eclipse is over, Eclipse is open, and that whole discussion is over, we're met with this screen. So we can click on Workbench right up here. And now we're met with another screen. Towards the left of the screen, we have something called Package Explorer, and right here we have Create a Java Project. So we'll click on that. Alright, and now we come up with a name. So we'll say project name, let's call it Test, and make sure that you have your JDK loaded, and you can just click Finish, because the rest of the details here aren't really too important. Alright, you can create a module, or you can skip that if you don't want to. Either one. Again, it's not very important. Alright, so now we have a folder called Test, we have the JRA system library, and we have a folder called SRC. So what we want to do is right-click the folder called SRC. All right, then we click New, and we click Class. All right, and now we can give it a name. Let's call it main, M-A-I-N, just like we had on Replit. We will click Finish. All right, and that's our first Java file in Eclipse, main.java. Right, and again, just like we had our main in Replit, where we can type out our code and run it, we can do the exact same thing here in Eclipse, except here we can do a little bit more with it. Here, we can run it once we have our code written. We can also do that in Replit, but we can also use Eclipse's built-in error checkers, things like that, to figure out where you might have errors in your code, typos, things of that nature, which you might not be able to do in Replit. All right. So personally, I prefer IDEA, so I'm going to use IDEA for the rest of this. But for the most part, it should be about the same. Just remember that whenever you want to run your code, you're going to type your code in here, and then you just run it with this green Run button towards the top left corner. I don't need Eclipse anymore, so I'm going to close out of it. I'm not going to bother saving. All right. So now I'll show you how to do it in IDEA if you've downloaded IDEA instead. So this should be the first thing that opens up after you install it, and you can click on Create New Project. All right, New Project. Don't need to worry about that. All right. So just choose whatever version of the SDK you want. And again, for Java, make sure that you have Java selected here. For Java, the SDK is the JDK. It's the same thing. Right. You can skip next past this screen, and you can come up with a project location. So let's find one. Let's say, and we'll call this IDEA. All right, and now we have a folder. We'll call this project test. And again, make sure that you save this to wherever you can consistently access your files and you won't have them tampered with. Finish. Yeah. If you don't have a file or a folder already created there, make sure that you allow it to create one. All right, and it should now be making our project. Here we go, loading project. Again, your IDEA will probably look a lot different from mine because I have a custom theme and a lot of plugins installed, and I think that's one of the best things about IDEA, that you can actually install all of those and make it look really nice while still being super functional. All right. So now that we're here, again, we have an SRC folder. So we'll want to right-click that, we click New, and we click Java Class. All right, and let's call it main again, M-A-I-N. We click OK. All right, public class main. And again, exact same thing as we had in Eclipse and in Replit. A class is essentially where you type out your code. It's how code is organized in Java. That's another way to think about it. Right, but now that we have a main class, we need to write a main method. And regardless of which IDE you're using, you can just follow along from this point. All right. So let's make our main method. We do that by typing public static void main, all in lowercase, and then open parenthesis, and then we say string with a capital S, args, open straight bracket, and then a close straight bracket. And then make sure you also close off that parenthesis as well. And then you add a brace as well, or a bracket, however you want to call it. All right, so make sure now that you have 2 open brackets and 2 closed brackets, and that you also closed off your open parenthesis with a closed parenthesis, and also for the straight brackets in the string args. Alright, so this is called your main method. Remember that this is your main class, but this is a method, so they're slightly different. When you choose to run your program, you can choose to either run the class or the method. For a program like this, it doesn't really matter because it's pretty small and everything we're doing will be in the main method anyway. But for some programs, you might need to run the class instead of the method, or vice versa. Alright, another thing, make sure that anytime you type a statement, you include a semicolon after it. So let me give you an example. We'll say system.out.print, and let's use the word, the words, hello there, exclamation point. Now, what this does is print the words, hello there, except you might notice that there's a red squiggly line right here, and it says semicolon expected. So we type a semicolon right there, and the squiggly line is gone. So this is what we need to have written. Alright, so if we run this, and again, we can run either the class or the method, whichever one works. Up to you. And now it's running. So in just a second, we'll see the console pop up. Alright, so now we have the console, and you can see that the system has printed the words hello there, exclamation point, to the console. Alright, that's good. That means it's doing exactly what we need it to. So let's talk a little bit more about semicolons. When you're doing something like this, make sure that you don't have a semicolon before a bracket, because that'll just make it impossible for Java to understand what you're trying to write. So it's alright if you have one after, but never before. So just remember, after a semicolon after a brace is legal, a semicolon before a brace, an open brace, is illegal. Alright, so one last thing. Make sure that you indent every time you have a brace. It makes it a lot easier to read your code. Makes it a lot easier to read your code because you can have sort of a stair-step pattern as you get deeper into certain methods. It makes it just more organized overall and a lot more readable if you have another person looking through it. Alright, so now that we've gotten most of the bare syntax out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about printing, about the output. Right, so what we have here is system.out.print hello there. Notice here that I put hello there inside quotation marks. If I get rid of the quotation marks, it gives me an error. And that's because it needs to be inside quotation marks. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. Alright. So let's try something. So instead of saying system.out.print, let's type in system.out.print ln. System.out.println is how you might find it pronounced. And it's short for print line. Alright, so notice what we have right here. And then we'll run this instead. And you might be able to notice the difference if your eyes are pretty attentive. Alright, so as you can see, there's one more line here. And that's because when you type system.out.println, what it does is print whatever's in here, and then it moves down one line. So it can be pretty helpful if you need to format your outputs in a particular way. Alright. So what else can we do? What other type of printing can we do? Well, we can do something called printf. That's actually a little bit more complicated, so we might be able to cover that when we cover strings. But it's good to know that it exists. Essentially, it's a way of formatting strings, and strings are just chains of characters, essentially. And yes, so printf just prints a formatted string in a way that you can have a lot of control over it. And it may not seem too useful just from that, but it's pretty useful. You can use it with numbers, and you can use it to display a certain number of digits. You can use it to display leading zeros or following zeros or a certain number of decimal points. There's a lot that you can do with it. In my opinion, it's actually really helpful. It's just that it's a little complicated, so we'll cover it more in depth later. Alright, so let's go back to our regular print. System.out.print, hello there, in quotation marks. Now what if we type \n right in the middle? Remember, not /n, because that would just type HEL/NLO. So \n. Oops. Right. Let's see what that gives us. Alright, so as you can see here, it moved on to the next line. That's because this \n is called the new line character. So it just moves to the next line. Alright, so let's try something else. Let's try \t. You might be able to guess what this means. Alright, so now it's inserted a tab after the HEL. And that's what the T stands for. So we can do this again with the letter R. I think this one's a little more tricky to guess what it does, just from the letter. Now here, this one just types "hello there" because the R stands for return, or carriage return. And what that means is whatever it prints out before this, in the same line, it will get rid of, and then it'll continue to type out whatever else is in the line. All right. And then the last one here we have is \b. And this one might be pretty simple to guess what it does. Alright, so this one just typed hello there, but with hello spelled with only one L. And that's because this B stands for backspace, essentially. So it prints out the HEL, and then it has a backslash, so it removes the L. So you just have that HE and then LO there. Alright. So just remember those four. You have N, which is new line. You have T, which is tab. You have B, which is backspace. And you have R, which is carriage return. The one that you'll see the most of by far is \n. And you'll see that on just about every computer science UIL test you could ever take. So just be familiar with what it means. And also be sure that you're always using \n instead of /n, because that won't be recognized as a special character if you just use /. Alright, so now that we've used a lot of backslashes, we might be wondering, how do we type backslashes? Alright, so let's type system.out.print \. And as you can see right here, we already have an error. So what we need to do is type \\. That might seem a little repetitive, but let's see what that prints. It types one backslash, or prints one backslash to the console. So what that means is, for every backslash that you want to print, you'll have to type 2 of those into the print statement. So let's say that you want to type 4 backslashes. If you want to print all 4, then you have to type 8. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So now it should print out 4 backslashes to the console. And like I said, that's 4. Alright. So then what about quotation marks? Since we have quotations on the outside, surely we can't use them on the inside too. If you try to, then it gives you another error. As you can see here, there's a red squiggly line underneath it. So again, as usual, the solution is \. So use \, and then quotation mark. And then you'll be able to use quotation marks as you please. Alright. So then here, as you can see, it just prints out quotation mark. If you want to type more quotation marks, just remember to also include more backslashes. And you should work out just fine. And finally, you can do the exact same thing with a single quotation mark, an apostrophe. Alright. And we can just run that. Yep, and you can see that it does the exact same thing. It'll just print out the apostrophe. And for the most part, that's about all there is, really, to Java, to the basics of Java output. So now we can talk a little bit more about syntax, and then we'll call it a day. All right, so how would you want to tell someone what your code does? In Java, what you use is something called comments, and you write those like this. You can have // and then you insert your comment. So it doesn't matter whatever is in your line. Maybe you have code in your line that you haven't tried out yet. Maybe you have something like system.out.print t, something like that. You can put that in a comment and it won't run it because it's just something there for you. The computer will kind of just skip over it entirely. If you want a comment that spans multiple lines, you type in /**, and then at the end of your comment you type */ and then we can just type in whatever we want into our comment here. We say Java is cool, JDK is cool, IDEA is cool, and again, we don't need to write // for every single one of those lines because we used a multi-line comment here. Right. And that's pretty convenient. And one more type of comment that you might find sometimes is something like this. And this is called a Java doc. Essentially, when an experienced programmer is trying to write something so that people who are reading through the code can understand what the code does, they'll use this type of comment. They might say, let's say we had a Java doc comment for this. We'll say this line prints the character apostrophe, and essentially that's all there is to comments. For the most part, there's not really any need to use these unless you're working on something professional. But for UIL purposes, you probably don't need to know very much about these, and they're pretty simple to understand. So that's all right either way. Just make sure that you know how to use a multiple line comment. All right, and that's about all we have for this lesson. And just as a quick reminder of what we went over how to get your IDE set up so that you can have a main class and a main method. We went over how you should format your statements and where you should put your semicolons. Remember, it should always be after a close bracket, never before an open bracket. We talked about how you should indent after every open bracket so your code is more organized. We talked about the different ways to print. System.out.print, use system.out.printf, and system.out.println. We also talked about how you need to have quotation marks in everything that you print. We talked about how you can use \n for new line, \t for tab, \r for carriage return, \b for backspace, \/ to print a backslash, \apostrophe to print an apostrophe, and \quotation mark to print a quotation mark. And finally, we went over comments. So we covered just about all there is to the basics of Java syntax and output. So if any of you have any questions, again, feel free to email me. Feel free to leave them on the Google Classroom, and I'll be happy to answer them. Right. So until next time, thank you all for watching. Goodbye.